Little Dolores watershed drains the north side of the Uncompahgre Plateau in far western Colorado and drains on the Utah side into the Colorado River, shown here in dark blue. It's the only perennial water within several hundred square miles of national conservation and wilderness areas, and thus serves of great importance to wildlife. This includes a prized elk herd and a biannual mule deer migration from the top of Pinyon Mesa down the Little Dolores drainage to the Colorado River and back every year. The high country supports a population of threatened Gunnison sage grouse, but it's also very impacted by 25 years of drought, which is falling many of the aspen forests and changing the local hydrology. Pinyon Mesa is ground zero for some of the biggest impacts of climate change. In the middle elevations of oak and pinyon juniper forest, pinyon and juniper have been encroaching on former sage grouse territory. In the canyon country of the Little Dolores, Russian olive and tamarisk are invading and in some places completely replacing the native cottonwood galleries. On adjacent upland benches, in some cases the drought and heavy grazing pressure has led to non-native weeds taking over the native vegetation. Accordingly, 5 years ago in 2018, Mountain Island Ranch decided to try some pilot restoration projects, starting small and meeting people and funders who could help us think through how to tackle some of these problems. The lower 20 miles of the river fall within the ranch, and we thus have an extraordinary opportunity. Some of these lands are managed by public agencies, and layers of partnerships were going to be necessary. After a few years of learning from these pilot projects, we decided to go big, and so we partnered with Colorado West Land Trust, who was able to secure a Restore Colorado grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. This allowed us to work together for several years, including many other partners, on much bigger restoration projects all up and down the Little Dolores watershed. The more we did, the more partners came to the table, bringing funds and expertise, and projects kept leveraging each other in a synergistic way across public and private land. This film partly serves as a report to the funders of this work, but it's also made with the landowner in mind who might want to try some of these approaches. Thus, it's kind of a lessons learned and a tutorial of what we've tried in this landscape, in hopes that it might inspire others. This was one of the main purposes of the Restore Colorado grant, to try projects on Mountain Island Ranch and learn lessons and share them with other landowners in the watershed.
My family's had the great privilege and challenge of stewarding Mountain Island Ranch for over half a century. It's a large working ranch with a mix of private lands and BLM allotments in both Utah and Colorado. It's been a bison ranch, a sheep ranch, and more recently an organic grass-fed cattle ranch. We put up all of our own organic hay, and we also run an annual deer and elk hunting operation. In addition to the restoration work we've done, our family has been very committed to conservation. In fact, all of the private ground is under conservation easements held by Colorado West Land Trust and Utah Open Lands. We were the first in our area to conserve our lands, and it was really important to us to encourage our neighbors to consider doing so as well. It took a long time, but most have conserved at least some of their ranches by now. Cattle, hay, and hunting are the primary economic drivers of the ranch, but it's really the restoration and conservation work that we're doing that excites us, and we love sharing the ranch as a living laboratory with other people.
And bringing experts here to help us solve problems and experiment themselves. And we love the educational component these projects provide, particularly young people, like some of the core crews that we've had come. And we've loved working with Colorado West Land Trust, who began their continuing stewardship program right around the same time we began our pilot restoration projects, where they have an ongoing relationship with landowners beyond just accomplishing a conservation easement, and work together on land management and future planning. So as we began to do restoration work on already conserved lands, they were just a perfect partner.
All of our decisions and planning have the next generation in mind. I took over from my mother 25 years ago, and I plan to pass the ranch on to my son, who lives and works here. The long-term hope, of course, is that we pass the ranch on to his children as well. It's not only a legacy, but a belonging to a place that is deep in our hearts.
Years of cattle and wildlife grazing and a change in hydrology caused by faster and more destructive snowmelts and runoff due to climate change has led to a number of changes on the ground. There are areas that should be wet meadows but have become incised deeper and deeper as channeled streams, and this has the effect of running the water off the landscape and drying out the meadows, which are used by a variety of species. Elsewhere, the change in hydrology and a lot of hoof action has caused erosion and head cutting, and has torn up ponds and stock ponds. So we got busy with the help of agency and consultancy friends and Western Colorado Conservation Corps youth, and we piled a lot of rocks and cut a lot of juniper boughs from lower elevations as part of another project we'll tell you about later, and took willow cuttings and created simple structures to slow the water's runoff. This will help it infiltrate the ground, keep the ground wetter longer, and reduce head cutting. We mixed post-assisted log structures, about which you'll learn a lot more later in the film, in combination with Z-dike rock structures to great effect. A year later, we had to go back and build the structures up higher because they had already been so effective in slowing sediment loss and a grading behind the structures.
We're kind of throwing the kitchen sink at things. We're putting everything in to try and bring that water table back up and start restoring some of the original channel configuration. When we have these degraded systems and water's in these systems, it's like you're living paycheck to paycheck. Every time it rains, you get a little bit of water, but the water runs through it. If we can rebuild these soil profiles, it's like having a savings account, and we're able to now bank water into the watershed on either side of the stream channel. Beavers are like an investment advisor. They take that and they compound that interest, and they build up water beyond what vegetation will allow.
To prevent hoof action from destroying the margins of ponds, we used a simple technique of laying dead wood about in such a way as to discourage animal use, and instead to access the water through off-site piping. Here you can see some of the post-assisted log structures, or PALs, and Z-dike structures in place, but the water hasn't had a chance yet to get backed up and infiltrate the soil. Whereas here you can see the result of letting these structures cook for a while. You can see how much water has been retained in the system, and the flats along the stream channel are now sopping wet. By emplacing a lot of these structures, we've slowed the water down, and by increasing the time spent in the system, it has infiltrated the soil farther and farther away from what are now stream channels. But in time, we're moving the entire wet meadow back towards being the wet fen it once was. This work's been a great opportunity to invite other landowners in the neighborhood and other interested people to come see the work in action and maybe even help. And we've really enjoyed working with the Youth Conservation Corps and having them camp on the ranch for weeks at a time. The final step was to add drift fences to discourage animals from trailing along the banks of the water channels and to disperse their impact on the landscape. Though we don't mind if this is what they're up to. Lastly, we invited some experts to look at our dying aspen forests and help us decide if there was something we ought to be doing, like building exclosures or coppicing stands, etc. And we held some community webinars for others concerned about their dying aspen. We did field tours, and ultimately we came to the conclusion that it's likely that, due to the 23-year drought, aspen simply can't persist on these drying mountaintops and are fading out.
Since European settlement, pinyon juniper woodlands have doubled and perhaps tripled in acreage across the western U.S. This woodland expansion has invaded into lower sagebrush flats with deeper soils where they rapidly deplete soil moisture, outcompeting sagebrush, perennial herbaceous plants, and eventually impacting mesic sites such as springs, streams, wet meadows, and wetlands critical during certain life stages of many sagebrush-dependent species, primarily the Gunnison sage grouse, as well as other sagebrush obligate birds such as the sage sparrow, brewer's sparrow, and sage thrasher. In addition, research demonstrates that sage grouse avoid areas with pinyon juniper encroachment during nesting and may reduce female survival and nest survival. Pinyon juniper encroachment into these habitats may also result in reduced lek activity and may influence or reduce habitat use among breeding adults and nesting females. This project location was chosen because it could be used as transitional or migratory habitat between summer and winter range for Gunnison sage grouse, and had already been treated to remove encroaching pinyon and juniper in the 1990s. We retreated the area, roughly 200 acres, by cutting all of the regrowth and scattering it around the site. Looking at some of the adjacent habitat, you will see that a lot of the denser pinyon juniper was likely sagebrush habitat at one time. Some of the pinyon and juniper branches were collected for use in the wet meadow work just described and for another project to be discussed later.
Lower down in elevation, we did some habitat treatments in areas where the sagebrush is actually the problem, not the desired cover. Many areas that were formerly native grass pastures have become taken over by old senescent sage, and there's mostly just bare ground in between each sage plant. So we brush hogged the sage and spread grass and forb seeds by hand before feeding cattle hay on top of the fresh seeding in the early winter. While feeding, the cattle hooves drove the seeds into the ground for us. In some cases, all we got was crested wheat, but elsewhere we had great success and watched native needle and thread and wildflowers and other desired plants flourish. The canyon portion of the Little Dolores River is a truly remarkable place, marked by a seemingly endless mature cottonwood forest. Unfortunately, beginning in 1958, invasive non-native Russian olive trees started taking foot in the riparian area, and bit by bit have been replacing the native cottonwoods and all of the plants associated with native cottonwood galleries. And each one of the thousands of olive trees act as straws, sucking up a dwindling water supply in the river system. While we do have some invasive tamarisk here, it's mostly a Russian olive problem we're dealing with. Left totally unchecked, they'll grow so thickly that almost nothing else will grow underneath. They're just about impossible to kill and will sprout from a freshly cut stump. The catch is, olive has been here so long it's become naturalized and almost everything seems to eat its seed. Bears make extensive use of the seeds, particularly in the late fall, when scats are typically comprised of nothing but olive seeds. But coyotes also eat them. As do raccoons and grouse and turkey and so many more. In addition to food, Russian olives can provide stream shading and daybed shading for a variety of creatures. Because olives have naturalized and so many creatures have come to rely on them in some way or another, we decided our goal wasn't to try to eradicate them, which would be a fool's errand anyway, but instead to reduce the percentage mix of olives in the riparian system. Rather than let them become totally dominant, let's bring them down to 5 or 10% of the ecosystem, and in some places, just leave thick warrens of olives. We also knew that repeat treatments would be required over time, and we needed to set ourselves up for a manageable amount of maintenance down the road. One of the challenges for us in considering a massive olive removal effort is that we're an organic ranch, and we knew that herbicides are the most common treatment for Russian olives. But we were also aware of mechanical means of removal and decided to try this first. So for our pilot program, we used an excavator to pull entire trees and root balls out of the ground, followed by a skid steer to pile the debris for burning. We considered using a mulching head, but the Russian olives in some areas are so thick that had we mulched it all, nothing would ever grow up from underneath the layers of mulch on the ground. While this mechanical method is very satisfying and one makes a lot of progress quickly, in the end we came to find that all it takes is a small bit of root matter left in the ground and you might have a new olive sprouting up. We didn't consider this a failure though. We learned a lot and in some places had good success in removing huge coverage of olive in a short period of time. We then began trying the cut stump method, where a tree is felled by chainsaw and a small amount of herbicide is applied with a spray bottle to the living vascular layers of the stump. When done properly, this method results in far less resprouting in our experience, though it's exponentially slower work and it requires a bigger crew and can just be very tough work. We mix the herbicide with seed oil to make it more viscous and less able to stick to what you apply it to, as well as marker dye. We tried many types of herbicides, and our experience with them is beyond the scope of this film, but in general, unfortunately, the more aquatic friendly, the less effective we found. Here's a series of before and after shots. Here you see the results of mechanical removal. The blue circles indicate the only native trees in the picture. Light teal or sage green are the Russian olive, and the deep green are the native cottonwoods. Here you see a stream bed that's been freed up and all of the olive was piled by the side. We also experimented using olive piles to direct cattle to water gaps. In areas where the olive was so thick we had to burn the piles to make room for something else to grow, but where we could, we would leave piles for habitat and diversity in the landscape. Another reason for concern about Russian olives is that if a fire were to pass through the area, they serve as ladder fuels, allowing flames to get from the ground up into the cottonwood canopy. In addition to removing olives, we try to pile them away from the trunks of the cottonwoods. We did considerable flagging of leaf trees in advance of any treatments. We left quite a few olives along the stream banks to shade the stream and left larger olives here and there as feed trees and habitat. Here's a bare daybed under one. Here's another before and after. As is common in the West, our ranch is a mix of private and public lands, and if we only treated our private, there'd be a checkerboard of habitat impact. We're very fortunate to have great working relationships with the Bureau of Land Management, And not only did they allow us to work on public lands with private funds we'd raised, but they also sent fire crews, when idle in the winter, to help do removal or burning of olives, and in general they just made for a great working partner. In areas like this where there are a lot of healthy cottonwoods, but olives growing underneath, we didn't use machinery at all and did everything by hand. When Colorado West received the Restore Colorado grant, and we were a subcontractor on that grant, we suddenly had a lot more funds available and hired a professional forestry crew to come in with a team of 10 people to hit the worst, densest areas of olives in the Cottonwood Gallery, areas that we couldn't reach with a machine. Usually 2 guys would run chainsaws, 1 or 2 would follow with a backpack herbicide sprayer, and everyone else was a swamper, doing the tiring and thorny work of hauling the olive slash into piles. Dragging the down materials into neat piles is the lion's share of the work, and Russian olives have nasty thorns. Being organic, we had to take sections of the riparian out of certification in order to use the cut stump method with herbicides. This meant having to be smart planners in terms of staggering our treatments geographically to allow places for the herd to water where we hadn't used herbicides. Much of the riparian area of the Little Dolores is not accessible by machine, and thus the cut stump method was our only choice anyway. In some instances, removing the Russian olives led to immediate release of the native cottonwoods or willows, which would shoot up 6 feet in the course of a single growing season. Elsewhere, though, the results have not been so dramatic, though perhaps we just need to be more patient. In mustard yellow, you see private parcels of the ranch, surrounded by public land. The colored squiggly polygons are areas where we removed or thinned Russian olive. You can see this work was on both public and private, and in all, we treated about 500 acres, with repeat treatments in some of these areas. Earlier in one of our pilot projects, we made what ultimately proved to be a costly and back-breaking mistake of planting 200 native shrubs in a couple of areas that we had cleared by excavator, where there was nothing but Russian olive, and once removed, bare ground. We built small mesh tents to prevent browsing and hand-watered them, but most of them died because it was a terribly droughty summer. Here's one of the areas where there was no native vegetation and thus why we tried plantings. But in a few years' time, this is what it looked like on its own, and we think shrubs will come next. Here you see a streamside bank covered in grass once the olives were removed and piled off to the side. In the right conditions, cottonwoods will quickly sprout up in the newly available space. When olives do resprout, they're very difficult to deal with because they're too spindly to cut with a chainsaw, and they thus require a foliar application of herbicide. This method uses much more chemical and requires coating the majority of the resprout, so we avoided it wherever possible. The last component of our invasive species management in the riparian area is the use of biocontrol of non-native tamarisk or salt cedar. We've released close to 250,000 tamarisk beetles, which eat the tamarisk foliage and can kill stands when the beetle establishes itself in robust enough populations. We got the beetles from the Palisade Insectary outside of Grand Junction. You release them in areas of thick and vibrant tamarisk, enough to support a colony of beetles, and generally have to repeat a few years in a row to achieve a sustained population. This is what you're looking for. Signs of larvae in the circle here, and reproducing beetles. "23 years of drought, combined with the effects of climate change, have dramatically altered many southwestern rivers and streams. In recent years, the once perennial Little Dolores has begun to dry up entirely for portions of the summer from lack of high elevation snowmelt. Also, streams in the southwest are naturally flash floody, but these days, rather than have slow, steady snowmelt at the end of winter, We now get freak warm spells in late winter and spring that can cause sudden fast melting of snow. This creates unusually intense runoffs that cut stream channels deeper and deeper, causing more erosion than usual and disconnecting them from their floodplain. This is the road into our headquarters in the spring flood. In healthy systems, beaver dams slow this rush of water and help stream channels meander, which takes velocity out of the system. The dams also store water and reduce the chances of a stream drying out entirely. This section of the Little Dolores River represents many of our restoration goals and still has beavers. Lower downstream, arcane water law disallows us to leave water in the stream as things dry out in the summer, and we have to use it all for field irrigation. As a result, beavers can no longer persist downstream of our hayfields. Enter the beaver dam analog, or in our case, the Post-Assisted Log Structure, or PAL. Working with Anna Branch Solutions, Utah State University, Western Colorado Conservation Corps, and Colorado West Land Trust, we set out to build small natural dams along 7 miles of the Little Dolores River. Anna Branch would teach crews of Corps youth how to use hydraulic post pounders, rocks, dirt, and vegetation to make simple but very effective structures that allow water to pass but simultaneously cause pooling behind them. We used juniper branches cut from the previously mentioned sage grouse habitat project and other found materials to create the primary straining material, and then pounded posts through this material into the stream channel. Getting the heavy post pounder to each site is often a challenging task. In some places, we could not get the pounder to the stream and thus had to simply put together jams out of found woody debris without much built structure. In either case, our point isn't to build dams that are going to be there forever. We know that floods will degrade or delete some or reassemble them, but with enough structures, we'll change the hydrology of the systems. Hopefully, once we've built enough structures and slowed enough water and kept the system wetter, beavers will someday be able to return to the middle reaches of the system, and they then become the maintenance of these dams, while creating their own.
Building a lot of structures in the stream. When I say structures, really what that means is, collections of wood. Most of them, given the dry conditions currently, are mimicking just, large woody debris that naturally would fall in channels and be influential on both hydrologic and geomorphic processes. All that means is that when you have more obstructions in your channel, wood in this case, you tend to see more, erosion of outer banks, development of scour pools, deposition of bars, sometimes full aggradation or deposition across the channel. Those things in turn get flows up out of the channel, over bank, which can be important for recharging groundwater and supporting riparian vegetation. So in a lot of cases, what we're doing is using the dead and down cottonwoods for our structure material. In other cases where we are closer to the roads maybe, or we are building structures that are designed to pond water immediately, we used juniper from the uplands that were part of an uplands treatment as well, and brought that down. So we're always trying to balance both logistics with what's appropriate in the stream. There's no single right answer in any of these places, and one of the sort of broad principles of this genre of restoration, which broadly falls under a low-tech process-based umbrella, is that we're a lot more comfortable with giving the river the tools it needs rather than fixing it. And so when we add wood, if this structure behind me, which is a loose collection of what was right here dead and down, had already fallen, moves downstream, however far it does, and reconfigures itself into a jam, that's something we're absolutely okay with. But where exactly those structures are much less important than the fact that we have a lot of them in the stream. Do these structures force the deposition of a lot of material upstream of them, or do they force the channel to widen? Both of those can be really important in terms of recovering incised channels. This channel is incised. Which one of those will happen, we don't know ahead of time.
We found it best to add larger rocks by machine to a PAL wherever possible, particularly in places that receive high velocity flows. We've also found it best to concentrate PALs within sight of each other, so as the water levels get low, the end of an impounded pool reaches back to the PAL behind it, and so forth. And we learned that adding heavier sticks along with juniper branches made for a stouter PAL. Here's an area where we did extensive Russian olive removal by machine, and now have added a number of post-assisted log structures. Notice the PAL, circled in green, has caused a high spring flow to overbank off to the right, into the forest. This creates the bare soil that cottonwood seeds need to germinate in. Having removed the Russian olive in the area certainly helps. Though too soon to tell in all of the places where we've worked, we've seen plenty of examples where the cottonwoods or willows have responded very quickly. In another example, a PAL caused significant overbanking and eventually breached on the side, which will help create a meander. Higher flows or floods damage many of the PALs, though often at the sides, which then causes water to cut away at an otherwise straight bank, and can induce the kind of meandering we want to see. And sometimes the high flows rob the PALs of all but the posts. However, that material is very likely to end up in another PAL downstream. And sometimes the entire PAL is gone but a post or two. Here, even a little debris is causing back eddying and the good kind of bank erosion. Notice all the standing water in the floodplain. In places like this, the Little Dolores River is acting like a river, not like an irrigation canal. Here's an area where we took all the removed Russian olive and tamarisk and stashed it off in a sort of crescent, like a dam, and it had the effect of backing up the main channel so far that it spilled out all over here and has since carved all these separate side channels, and it's really hard at this point to tell which one's the main channel, and by spreading out so far it's put sediment way back over towards the bank there, and you're seeing all these cottonwoods starting to try to come up. What we're doing today is another form of structure in the stream, and these are not highly built beaver dam analogs or post-assisted log structures. We just had crews walk either bank where we've removed Russian olive and tamarisk and just throw all this cottonwood material and whatever was on the banks into the stream, which already has the effect of slowing the water and creating some shading. And we found a lot of frogs in the process. But next time it floods or we get a big rain event, a lot of this will start to get stuck in places and form jams, and then the weeds will get stuck on that, and you'll have back pooling. And then meanwhile, what we're doing now is planting willows that we've cut from an area up above, and we're caging them to give them a head start against the elk. And I think in short order we'll find that the stream banks here are covered in willows, but also there are a lot of cottonwoods coming up now that they have light and bare soil, and they no longer have the competition from the Russian olive and tamarisk, which occupy the soil, take the light, but also suck up a lot of the water.
These are not big tree willows. These are more like big shrub type willows, but they provide great bird habitat, and there's sort of a lack of them in here. And you can see the tamarisk kind of makes up a little bit of that niche, that little tamarisk next to the cottonwood there. So ideally we'll be able one day to remove that tamarisk, and we've got these willows planted here, and it's already pretty good bird habitat, but it'll be really nice to have below ground dense vegetation cover close to the water. That's like really good wildlife habitat. And then we want to build a cage around it to keep it from herbivory, because theoretically by the end of the week here, these are going to start leafing out, and they're going to look really yummy to everything.
In all, we built 253 structures over a couple years along a 7-mile stretch of river. Surveying them recently, we found that about 60% of them were gone from their original location, with the material typically repositioned downstream as new structures in locations that the river chose, or stacked up against a resolute structure. A little aside and lesson learned concerns treating Russian olives in the winter. We found that, contrary to the literature, herbicides are ineffective when applied in the winter months to Russian olives, but sometimes that's when you have a crew available. In such circumstances, we had crews high stump, in other words, remove most of the Russian olive, but leave an obvious high stump to then cut to the ground in the spring and apply herbicide then when it's effective. But due to all the beaver structures we built and a good spring runoff, when it came time to cut and treat the high stumps this year, they were surrounded by standing water. By the time the water receded, the stumps were bushy shrubs, and it took 10 times as long to finish the job. Giving these bushy resprouts a haircut is no fun. When water levels get really low, it's common that the only remaining water in the system is found behind our structures, and it's no surprise that that mud is usually full of animal tracks. It's true that some of the places where we've done the most Russian olive removal and burning of piles and building of pals and so forth can look like a war zone when you're finished. But in time, with a little patience, things naturalize. There are an estimated 620,000 miles of barbed wire fence bisecting the American West. That's 2.5 times the distance from the Earth to the Moon. Animals ranging from owls to pronghorn to deer and elk get tangled up in barbed wire and can die a gruesome death hung on a fence. And woven sheep fence is impenetrable to small animals and fawns. Mountain Island Ranch has been a bison ranch, a sheep ranch, and a cattle ranch, with different fencing requirements for each class of livestock. In some cases, we wanted to entirely remove fence that isn't needed anymore. Elsewhere, we wanted to remove the 5th and 6th wires, since bison are no longer on the ranch. And elsewhere, we wanted to convert barbed fence to smooth wire fence, or a mix of barbed and barbless wire. These are tasks that don't usually rise to the top of the list of what needs to happen on a busy ranch. And most ranches don't have a budget for removing fence. To help us remove hazard fences and upgrade to wildlife-friendly fencing, our restore funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation allowed us to hire Conservation Corps crews to help, and Colorado West Land Trust organized volunteer days. We had great fun teaching volunteers how to remove or amend fence, and our outings allowed us to introduce many people to the conservation goals of the ranch, while giving them an inside look at a real working ranch. Over the past couple years, we either removed or amended to make wildlife friendly about 8 miles of old fence. And we brought nearly 8,000 pounds of fence to the steel recycling facility. This may be a drop in the bucket measured against all of the fence in the West, but it's a very substantial number for our ranch. Without the volunteer help, it would have taken impossibly longer to accomplish this much. The Little Dolores watershed is home to a world-class Rocky Mountain elk herd and the significant mule deer migration mentioned earlier. These ungulates, as well as bear and many other creatures, depend on healthy, diverse native vegetation to survive. The stresses of drought and climate change are giving invasive weeds the upper hand, and even in places that have been given complete rest from livestock grazing, native plants are often struggling to compete. Funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's Restore Grant and other grants have allowed us to experiment with different seed mixes, different planting techniques, and novel approaches to try to increase native plant forage and cover. We've worked with Colorado Parks and Wildlife and the NRCS and other consultants to set up trial plots and monitoring sites to study our progress. Here you see us borrowing Colorado Parks and Wildlife's homemade pothole seeder. It creates disturbances of the ground surface to create microhabitats that can accumulate water or provide shade to the seeds it drops into each small hollow. The tracks of wildlife or livestock can create similar opportunities for plants in the otherwise meager growing conditions of the desert in a drought.
These large discs are offset, so we have these big notches, and when one disc is digging, the one adjacent to it is not digging. And that gives you kind of a checkerboard pattern of mounds and holes.
These tubes drop seeds into the divots. We tried this seeding technique with various wildlife-oriented seed mixes in portions of upland pastures or formerly irrigated fields that have been abandoned due to inadequate water supply. Here's a former hayfield that we no longer have enough water to irrigate, but rather than let it become all weeds, we're trying test plots to see if we can generate better native diversity. To date, we honestly haven't had much luck with the potholer. It seems to work better in places where the soil isn't as sandy as ours, and in some test plots, the ground disturbance actually made the weeds worse. For example, here's another abandoned hayfield, and all of the dark matter in this 1-year-old test plot is invasive Russian thistle. We don't consider such results to be failure. We tried to do something about a problem, we learned something in the process, and these lessons will inform future actions. Elsewhere in hayfields that are getting much less water than in the old days, we used a no-till drill to add a diverse mixture of mostly native seeds into these fields, focusing on using seeds of plants that are more drought tolerant. Each of these colored polygons represents a different seeding experiment, with different planting techniques, seed mixes, and results. This is just an example map, and it doesn't show all of the areas where we've tried seeding experiments. At the end of the day, we're feeding as many deer and elk as we are livestock. And we're doing everything we can to help this landscape adapt to the rapidly changing conditions around us. It's been a lot of work, but it's incredibly rewarding. We've met an amazing network of inspiring people, provided part-time work for dozens and dozens of others, and provided innumerable educational opportunities for all involved, not the least of which ourselves.
I would say that it's not for the faint of heart. A lot of this work is difficult and time-consuming and costs quite a bit, but without the partnerships we've had, we couldn't have done it alone. And you have to be prepared for failure as well as success. And it takes time. It's a lifetime engagement.
Continuous maintenance will be required,
Yes.
for sure. One of the challenges, of course, is that we're dealing with nature, and we never know what's coming. This could all get a heavy flood next spring, and it destroys some of these cages we just put up. The elk could destroy 2 out of 3 of these. It might dry out so bad this summer that they just don't make it. And you know, we can already see some little bits of tamarisk coming back up in places where we've removed it. But you know, persistence. You need to be persistent, and honestly, spending a day doing this work in this crazy, depressing world is a reward unto itself. It's a great way to be on the planet right now.